One of the fastest ways to sync a project is to dive into building before fully developing the requirements. Because if you skip this step, you'll eventually find yourself discovering hidden problems, like halfway through the project. Problems that'll force you to rethink everything that you've done up to that point. And at that point, later in the project, it's much harder to recover. But right now, at the early stage of your project, you still have the flexibility to identify what's needed and get resources and get additional training or explore alternatives before you hit the gotchas. In project management, there is a concept called the cone of uncertainty. And at the beginning of a project, estimates for time, cost, and scope they're really broad and they're really unreliable. And that's okay, that's normal. But later, as requirements are clarified, the cone starts to narrow and you can make more accurate predictions. Developing requirements and narrowing that so-called cone is how we moved from vague guesses to realistic plans. And that's all about reducing risk and turning abstract goals into detailed steps that everyone can work with. So think of requirements as communication tools that connect businesses, leaders, users, and developers, and puts them all on the same page. And each level of requirements speaks to a different audience. So at the top, you have project goals that are business driven, and they answer the question, why are we doing this project? And then moving down to the middle, user stories are user driven. They describe scenarios from the user's perspective, such as looking up customer information or collecting a payment online. And then at the bottom level, there are tasks that are developer-driven, and they describe what steps the team will actually take to implement the user stories. So this structure, where you group requirements in these three levels, make sure that everyone from sponsors to coders is on the same page. In Agile and other methods, user stories are often written in a format like, as a role, I want a particular feature so that I get some benefit. For example, you could write, as a sales rep, I want to look up customer information so that I can respond quickly to customers. That would be one user story. And this captures everything from the user's perspective, and it's different than simply saying the system must have some kind of customer lookup function, because thinking in terms of user stories emphasizes the human need behind the requirement, not just the technical feature. And once we understand the story, we can break it down into the tasks, such as get the customer identifier, connect to the data source, and retrieve the information and stuff like that. So you see how that works. It's the mid-level requirement written as a user story in that particular format that makes it possible to go to the next level of detail. One of the most valuable outcomes of developing requirements is that it'll bring hidden assumptions up to the surface. For example, the business might say, we need a cloud-based system. But what does that even mean? And do we need to choose between AWS or Azure? And do we even have the expertise to support that platform? And is cost a factor? Because without developing requirements, these questions will stay unanswered until they cause serious delays or disappointments when you make the wrong choices later on. Another benefit of clearly developed requirements is that they provide traceability. You can connect each task back to a user story and each story back to a project goal. And this chain of alignment protects us against what we call scope creep. Because if a new request comes in that doesn't connect back to the original goals, you can identify it as outside the agreed scope. And without this traceability, projects often drift, adding new features without considering whether they actually even serve the original purpose. In this course, your sponsors can talk in broad terms about their business needs, and they might say things like, we want an app that helps employees connect, or we need to streamline customer onboarding. But it's your job to translate those high-level goals into mid-level user stories and then low-level tasks that can actually be built. This is the essence of requirements development, bridging the gap between the language of business and the work of developers. So as you move forward, make sure you understand exactly what needs to be done. Over the next few weeks or so, you need to make sure you have the right tools, whether that means software, hardware, or skills to carry it out. Now's the time to identify gaps and address them while changes are still manageable. Because developing requirements is not just busy work, it's how you turn a customer's vision into an achievable plan. And if you do it thoroughly now, you'll avoid painful surprises later and give your project the strongest chance of success. Oh, it's okay. Thanks.